McCuistion for over 28 years, talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McCuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the Hatton W. Sumner's Foundation, helping to educate the public about the fundamental principles of their democracy and thus be in a position to help formulate public policy. Moss Adams LLP, certified public accountants and consultants, providing industry-smart tax, assurance, and consulting solutions to help businesses and their owners succeed since 1913. The University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
Yeah, so just who are these millennials we keep hearing so much about, and why should you care? This is part one of a two-part program on millennials, and our experts will not only tell you who millennials are and why you should care, they'll tell you why millennials are good and getting better, and perhaps why you should be a bit concerned as well. So let's meet the experts. First on my left, no, I'm gonna start on my right, I'm sorry. Kurt Andre, Master Certified Coach who helps government, business, and nonprofit leaders deal with the practical aspects of transformational change. Personal journey includes marriage and 3 children, all of whom are millennials and working, I think is great. Degrees in sociology, church history, and a doctoral study in postmodernism, with an emphasis on understanding millennials. And if you can do that, Kurt, I bow down to you, I do. Sitting next to you, Dr. Jack McCallum. He is chairman and CEO of Integer Health. He's a neurosurgeon, he's a serial entrepreneur, and he's a college professor. So, Jack, I have to ask you, how did your journey lead you to talking about millennials? And in particular, I want you to tell us what you think about the millennial brain.
Well, the interest came really from the fact that I spent the better part of my career dealing with brains, messing around in brains and things like that. And then for the last 17 years or so, I've taught over at TCU, mostly, tried to teach mostly survey courses to freshmen and sophomores. So I've spent a lot of time around millennials, and the thing that has really fascinated me is, in the first place, how that age group has changed over the last couple of decades, and particularly how their brains work differently and how they approach the world differently than you and I do, Dennis.
Well, they approach it differently because they're just younger, maybe, huh?
They approach it differently because they are at the leading edge of one of the most dramatic changes in human history.
Well, you mentioned when you and I talked ahead of time, because we've known each other for a few years, that there were sort of 2 or 3 really basic big changes over history. Give us some sense of the first and the second one and why you think this is the next one.
We've got good records for 2 prior fundamental changes in how brains work. The first is with writing. And that's a really interesting change. You can sort of date that around, 2500 BC to really around 750 BC. And think about for a minute what writing did. As opposed to only being able to communicate face to face, when you write things down, you can communicate over distance. You don't have to be in the same room. You can communicate over time. Information can be recorded accurately once and last. You can, if you write things down, you can organize it in a way that you can't organize oral communication. And finally, it's a little bit more subtle but really important. Writing allows you to create analogies and metaphors. It allows you to give color to information. Writing fundamentally changed how people interacted with the world. And that fundamental change really lasted for a millennium and a half until about 1454, when writing was superseded by printing. Printing was a phenomenal change. So a couple of interesting numbers. The number of books printed between 1454 and 1500 was somewhat more than had been produced in the previous 1,000 years. Printing between 1454 and 1600, by 1600 there were 250 printing presses in Western Europe, turning out 12 million books. Writing went from being something that was very hard to access, written things being aggregated in just a tiny number of places, like Byzantium or Baghdad or Toledo, or before it burned down, Alexandria, to being present across the civilization. And that made a phenomenal number of things possible. After printing came the ability, the Renaissance and the Age of Exploration and the Enlightenment and the ability for Newton to change physics, for Smith to change economics, for Locke and Montesquieu and Jefferson and Madison to change politics, and the Industrial Age, where we changed how we dealt with power and how we dealt with transportation, and the Modern Age, where we got antibiotics and anesthesia and doubled lifespan, and, oh yeah, 2 world wars and genocide and nuclear weapons and global warming. The Millennials are the third wave of that. And it's a bigger change than either of the other two. And there are things that we can look at in the other two that maybe we can talk about a bit that will give a bit of insight into where we are and some reasonable guesses about where we're going with the Millennials.
Okay, good. I appreciate that. Now, Kurt, he's given us a very broad landscape there. I suspect that because you have 3 Millennials, that perhaps you've had some personal experience. Would that be true?
It would be. Started my career actually working with young people in 1978. Spent about 20 years working with adolescents 6th through 12th grade on into college. What compelled me into being fascinated by them as a generation was a shift that I began to observe, and it really first started with language. Phrases I would use had a completely different understanding to them. When I was in high school, having a friend with benefits was being a freshman who knew a senior who had a car, she didn't have to ride the bus. That's not what that phrase means today. And then having young people, having 3 little ones, and trying to understand who these people are, that's what compelled me back into my graduate work. And then having, not having raised, I'm still raising. I was just in Guatemala this past weekend with my daughter, who was a high school English teacher, not being able to make a difference. She's like, Dad, if I could just take them home, I can make an impact. And so that's what she's done. She's moved to Guatemala, works in a nonprofit, helping women come out of the sex trade, prostitution, and transition into life. She, to me, is a classic millennial, wanting to make a difference. Socially adept when it comes to social media and technology. I talk to her every day. I talk to her in Guatemala more than I do my son, who lives an hour away from me in Arlington, because of technology. So it's been interesting for me to see, raising 3 Millennials and then working with that generation to see who they are, and a pretty amazing generation of young people.
Do we have a problem, however, of trying to generalize about things? I mean, we spend a lot of our life generalizing about this and that, and yet we're all individuals. So what are those things that you see that are sort of most typical of this particular generation?
Certainly vision and mission driven. Raising my 3 basically with the mantra, find out what your passion is and figure out how to get paid for it. I'm the son of immigrants. My parents, grandparents came over and worked in a job that they hated, but did it out of duty and obligation. I don't think millennials will do that. There's less tolerance for obligation and more commitment to mission. The fact that they're willing to do what they're important. Now, Alyssa in Guatemala is working with women coming out of the sex trade. Her twin is on Broadway in musical theater. He would represent more of the self-entitled, narcissistic, my world's about me. She's all about mission and vision. And I think those are both classic millennial archetypes.
Interesting. Well, that's fascinating stuff.
And I say that with great love.
Yeah, I understand you. Yeah, we appreciate that. Yeah, they will remember that too when they hear you go back and say that when they watch this program.
Narcissistic and entitled, Dad, what are you talking about?
What do you mean? Yeah,
right.
So Jack, take us through this third change, and particularly how it affects the millennial's brain.
One of the things that people in our advanced age group are prone to do is criticize or make fun of the kids for their interaction with their devices. For us, those look like tools, and sometimes they look like an annoyance. Those are extensions of the millennial brain. Those are a function of how millennial people interact with the world. So a couple of interesting kinds of numbers. We generate 2.5 quintillion bytes of information a day. We generate 3.6 trillion tweets a year. An engaged millennial, which is most of them, will either send or receive a social medium message of one sort or another about every 4 minutes of their waking life, which translates, as best as I can tell, to being the second most common thing that they do after breathing. That's not a toy, that's not a device. That is a way to interact with the world. There is a fundamental difference in how millennials approach the world they live in as opposed to the way we approach the world we live in.
Okay, I have this cartoon. I wish I'd brought it. So here's the cartoon. So I want to try this on you folks. So some of you are in my generation. So have you ever seen a situation where you went to a restaurant and you saw an older couple, a lot of times in the cafeteria, an older couple had gone through the line, gotten their food, and are sitting at a table, and they eat their entire meal without talking to each other. You ever seen that happen? Right. Okay, it happens a lot with old people. The cartoon I have shows two millennials sitting at the table, and they are texting each other across the table, and they're saying, "Do you see that other couple at the table next to us? They haven't texted each other one time during dinner." I mean, that's a crazy thing, isn't it?
That's not a crazy thing, it's just how it is.
Yeah, but is that good or bad? I'm concerned about that.
You know, you can't make a value judgment about that. Here's the thing about the other two waves of change that I think is going to be absolutely true of this wave. Let me go back to the printing thing. So here was an example. Prior to the development of printing, if you wanted to study a book, you had to travel to the book. And it may mean you had to travel across 3 countries and 3 months, and you got one look. It was a universal skill among educated people in 1400 to be able to read a book one time and commit it to memory. It was an absolutely universal skill that everyone had who was highly educated. By 1500, that skill had vanished because it was irrelevant. No longer did anybody need to do the memorization. In fact, they didn't waste the time doing the memorization. They could learn new things. The situation for the millennials, look, 90% of the information that's been created in human history was created in the last 2 years. Samuel Johnson said, there's 2 kinds of knowledge. There's knowing a thing and knowing where to find information upon a thing. Both of those are out of date. There is no need to memorize names, dates, and places. You have them in your pocket. There is no need, like you and I had to do, to figure out where you go to do research. It's in your pocket. Those 2 skills are gone. The problem for millennials, and we can talk about this a little bit more, the thing that millennials have to deal with is A, they have 3 orders of magnitude more information at their fingertips than we ever had. A lot of that information is invalid. Some of it is harmful. At the very least, they're faced with having to organize and assess this fire hose, this flood of information.
But I don't think you know this, but everything on the internet is true. Haven't you heard this? I just want you to know that. I want to show you something that is true. I want to look at graphic number 1, number 2, and Kurt, I want you to look at these. And so this is, in October 2004, Neil Howe, William Strauss, wrote a book called Millennials, The Next Generation. And they say between 1982 and 2004 when they were born. Pew Research Center started to find some between 81 and 96. So today, millennials are those who are 22 to 37 roughly. Now you talk about some markers for millennials. I want to know what that means. And then secondly, I want you to tell me something about what that viewer needs to know about millennials that will help us not only understand but appreciate them more.
So those are great questions. So in the work that I do in businesses, and again, working in nonprofit, private, and public, is around performance management. And so very often you'll have boomers who are doing performance management with millennials the way it was done with them. 3 conversations a year, sign and date, put it in the file cabinet. Because of social media, millennials are used to the constant hit, constant feedback. That the way to do effective performance management today is a conversation that takes place through the course of the year. Constant feedback. How am I doing? What expectation? Am I succeeding, failing? So, and functioning in much more of a dynamic relationship than a formal conversation a couple times a year. Because millennials want to know, how am I doing? I think there's a myth around working with millennials that they are lazy. They're not. They have a very different work ethic. They might not have a business work ethic. They have a self-centric work ethic. So working very hard, but more on their terms than what would be a 9 to 5 expectation from boomers.
Yeah, but look, you don't understand, Kurt. You understand. Those of us who are our age and these people's age, we're in charge. We own the companies. We manage the companies. When those young people come in, they should flex to what we want. Isn't that true?
Well, it's interesting. So when my family gets together, so my dad's 80, okay, I'm almost 60. We have a bunch of millennials and then a handful of Generation Zs coming up. The interpretation of the grandparents in the room is that when you have your device in your face, it's rude because you're being disrespectful, you're not present. Yet for them, like Jack, I appreciate what you were saying, that it's an extension of their communication. They're actually talking to each other in the room. And so I think when it comes to millennials coming into the workforce, and you know, I like to use 82 to 2002 kind of as a marker, so that, you know, the upper end of the millennials are 36, like you said, 37, and that they're moving into significant positions of leadership. One of the fascinating things to me, again, when a millennial comes into a company, that they really like a more flat organizational structure. My generation, our generation, you earned your stripes and you made your way up to the food chain where you had a voice at the table. Millennials want a voice at the table right out of the chute. I'm working with a guy right now, 55, hire a 32-year-old. They're having struggles in their conversation relationship, and he finally asked her a question, and she said to him, I see it, we're coworkers. He's like, no, I'm your boss. He said, yeah, I know, but we're coworkers. So just the expectation of working collaboratively in a flat organization, constant feedback, and having a voice at the table, I think those of us who are boomers and older need to understand, and I think and embrace, instead of labeling or characterizing who millennials are, realizing that they're a gift to who we are. Having a conversation earlier about the problem-solving abilities of millennials. Dynamic, to me, I call them professional amateurs. They've just become really good at learning. There's a great article written in the Harvard Business Review by a friend of mine, Ronnie Heifetz, 2009. I called it Leadership in Permanent Crisis. When I was in part of my studies and looking at the social media of millennials, there's a phrase that as soon as I say it, everybody here in the room is going to know exactly what I meant. It's not used in their language. Once the dust settles. We know that metaphor, but in the millennial framework and language, they don't use that because the dust never settles. So they're very comfortable working and living in a dynamic environment.
But the problem is they can't construct a sentence without using the word like 3 times. Well, what's that all about?
Well, it's interesting. So my wife's a therapist, and she's coaching a number of millennials. I think one of the things that I do see with millennials using devices is their stunted ability to have face-to-face interaction and to know how to have a conversation. There was a great clip on the Big Bang Theory where one of the characters had a blind date, and that's what they did. The entire date was through texting. Now, it was a caricature, right? So it was there for comedy, but it makes a statement that even though it's like an umbilical cord for them, connection to the world, I'm seeing a challenge for them to, again, engage, because, you know, most of communication is nonverbal, and the challenge to grow in that direction.
Okay. Now, Jack, I don't know what you do in your classrooms. I don't let my students use laptops, iPads, phones in my class at all. none of the classes I teach, they have to do without them. They're going naked. Is that good, bad, or indifferent from my standpoint?
I do the same thing, but I'll tell you that in the recent edition of the DSM, the Diagnostic Manual for Behavioral Health Diagnoses, there is now a section for deprivation of devices.
Oh my gosh!
I also have I have a 23-year-old who is a very bright young lady. She's very grounded, and I have a huge amount of respect for her intellect. We took her on a trip in Southeast Asia on a train that for 4 days did not have internet. It was fascinating to watch. This is a very solid kid. After about 6 hours, she started getting a little twitchy. Then she got irritable. Then she got absolutely anxious and lost her appetite. She was in classic withdrawal. So here's an interesting thing. All of the interaction with social media, the absolute characteristics of that interaction is those interactions are repetitive, they are intensive, and they are self-supporting. They are the exact characteristics of anything that causes dopamine release in the brain and causes addiction. Interaction with these devices is not, for people in that age group, this is not an elective. This is not something that they do for fun. This is how their brains actually function.
Isn't that bad, though? Isn't that bad? What is it? I mean,
it's irrelevant to make a
judgment. It is, but
I wouldn't say it's bad. It's benign. It's how it's used.
I would say that it is.
Is what?
That it is.
It's
not good or bad. It just is.
Okay. Well, I'm making a value judgment. It's bad. I'm telling you.
The good news for them is that you and I are on the way out.
That's true.
Well, technology doesn't come with rules or civility. Again, it's benign. It's how it's used.
What it is.
Right.
Yeah, but you talk about tribes. I mean, tribes is a big thing. I haven't read all of Amy Chua's book yet on political tribes. It's a whole other issue. But you talk about tribes of millennials. What does that mean exactly?
Tribes within
their
millennials?
Loyalty to tribes instead of a company or an institution or whatever. What does that mean?
Well, I'm not sure if this is where you're going with your question, Dennis, but even our conversation today, when we're talking about millennials, are we talking about white, suburban, affluent millennials? Racial minorities don't necessarily have the same social capital to be able to engage and have some of the same markers as upper class, again, generically white millennials, and so they're incredibly diverse generation. And the whole idea of tribes emerging in the late 80s, that millennials are far more diverse, far more tolerant, far more embracing. Of the 8 grandchildren that my parents have, there are, I think, 5 nationalities represented by who people are dating and marrying. Now, I spent most of my life overseas, but we still stay within our ethnic world. That's not true for millennials. They're far more diverse and diffused.
Which sounds like a good thing there,
well,
doesn't
I
it?
would argue that it is,
Right.
absolutely, because it breaks down those barriers.
Right. I like that, Jack.
I was just, when you said that, I was thinking about, we were way up in the Kenya-Somali border in a little Samburu market, and they were literally selling spears in that market, truly spears, and trading goats and homemade weaving things. And off in the corner was one guy with a whole collection of 12-volt batteries recharging cell phones.
That's a great image.
That was the piece of technology. So here's the thing. I really don't think you can say that it's good or bad. It is what it is. In the same sense, Plato thought writing was bad. He thought it led to superficial knowledge. Lots of people thought printing was bad. It led to the Reformation and 100 years of religious war. But both were what they were. Some good things happened and some bad things happened as a result of both. There will be good things and bad things that happen as a result of this.
Sure.
Millennials they're good scanners. They think they can multitask. They can't, but they switch quickly.
Right.
And they do it very effectively. They probably have pretty good, they probably have better visual spatial relationships than you and I have. And I think those things are for true. Let me tell you a couple of things that worry me. And they worry me in relation to the volume of information that's out there and in relation to something you said a minute ago. One is a thing that Danny Kahneman calls the availability heuristic. It's the fact that it's almost impossible for people to tell the difference between truth and repetition. The things that you hear the most seem the most important. The other example would be confirmation bias. You tend to seek out information that supports what you already believe. The problem in the current information world is that it's so vast that you can find support for almost anything.
Exactly right. Well, listen, thank you both for being here. I'm sorry the time has gone so fast. It always does. It's sort of a millennial program. I haven't taken out my phone yet. I'm not going to, but thank you for being here. You know, I'll bet that you are either a millennial or you have a child or grandchild who is, or else that you have millennials who work for you. Well, I'm sorry. No, I'm serious. Our fate is largely in their hands. Scary stuff. And I feel pretty good about that in many ways. Yes, I do. Tune in next week for part 2 of this series. Follow us on Twitter. And oh, I know, you're not a millennial and you don't tweet. Okay, well, go to McCuistionTV.com for more quality programs where we're always talking about things that matter with people who care and some who even use social media. Thank you for joining us.
A DVD of this program is available for $20 plus $5 postage and handling, and in Texas, applicable tax. For more information, call 214-750-5157 or email Nikki N at NikkiMcCuistion.com. Visit our website at www.McCuistionTV.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at www.twitter.com/McCuistionTV or download McCuistion TV video podcast on iTunes. Production of McCuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the Hatton W. Sumners Foundation, helping to educate the public about the fundamental principles of their democracy and thus be in a position to help formulate public policy. Moss Adams LLP, certified public accountants and consultants, providing industry-smart tax, assurance, and consulting solutions to help businesses and their owners succeed since 1913. The University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
So just who are these millennials we keep hearing so much about, and why should you care? I'm Dennis McCuistion, and on this week's program, we'll tell you who they are and why you should care, plus we'll show you that they really are different. And is that good or bad? Join us. Okay, well.